Multiplayer games, especially competitive multiplayer games, almost always come with the assumption that the game is not yet finished. I'm not just talking about overpriced early access games that sell DLC before they can even be run on a graphics card lower than a 1080. No, pretty much every multiplayer game out there is going to change in the future, one way or another. Some games might receive a lot of updates and changes, adding new characters, new maps, and others might just get an update to some damage values once a year. But every one has at least a few updates throughout their life cycle. And when support for the game eventually ends, simply because it's no longer profitable for the company to support it, there's always a little more tweaking that could be done to make the game just a little bit better. While multiplayer games are being supported, many of the tweaks and changes made to the game are known as balancing, changing values or reworking characters to try to keep everyone on a level playing field. The patch notes for most games will be totally filled with these balance changes just about every update. If you play a competitive game, you're probably used to this by now. A character you love gets nerfed, a character you hate gets buffed, and for one person it might lessen the experience, but as a whole the point of balancing is to make the game more fun for the entire player base. But balancing too much comes with risks and consequences. A lot of companies don't seem too worried about those consequences and what they're doing to their game. For a good example of how you probably shouldn't do balancing, let's look at Hi-Rez Studios and Smite. Every time Hi-Rez releases the patch notes for this game, they're absolutely filled with balance changes. Dozens of items have their stats changed, and dozens of gods have their values changed. Most notably the newest god, who almost always receives constant changes the first few weeks after their release. This does a few different things to hurt their player base. Firstly, by changing items and gods so often, players who don't keep up with the changes for even a few weeks can be left behind and may be wondering why the combo on their god just doesn't do enough damage anymore, or why their build isn't as effective as they remember it. This can make a lot of returning players turn away, but also brand new players, because the way they see it, there's no point in learning builds because those items are probably going to change anyways, and may become useless, and they don't have the time to study the patch notes every single week. This is even more of a problem with the release of new gods. Hi-Rez seems to go by the philosophy that if they mess up on the initial release, they can always just fix it with balancing. With the release of just about every new god, the patch notes for the next several weeks are filled with often drastic changes to their damage, health, and other stats. The character is practically still in development weeks after its release, and this is a serious issue. When a new character comes out, there's pretty much no point in learning any combos or trying to keep track of how much damage you can tank, because the character's stats are inevitably going to change. Unfortunately, just ignoring the character until they're finished usually isn't an option, because new releases are often so overpowered that if you want to play competitively, you might be required to play them at least every now and then. In the first few weeks after a character's release, it can start to feel like all the time you're putting into them is being wasted, because they're going to see changes and you're going to have to relearn parts of them. Some people have theorized that Hi-Rez intentionally releases overpowered characters to give people a reason to buy and play them, and if that's true, it's an extremely short-sighted plan. In the short term, you make more money with a release and they see more play, but in the long run, you're losing more money than you will make from people deciding they don't have time to relearn a character every week and quit the game. Smite obviously does balancing way too often, and they release characters the wrong way, but for an example of balancing done at least mostly right, let's take a look at Hearthstone. In Hearthstone, there are occasional balance updates to cards, but the difference here is they're used extremely sparingly. Actually changing the stats of a card is always used as a last resort. Instead, before releasing a card, they test it thoroughly. All of the balancing that Smite does after the release of a character, Hearthstone does to their cards well before they can be used by everyone. Because in Hearthstone, changing a card doesn't just change that card. If they released a 2-mana card and decided it's a bit too strong and should probably be 3 mana, they can't just make that change and be done with it. That card was put into decks as a 2-mana card, and most decks can't just have their mana curve shift suddenly and still work fine. And if the 2-mana card they're balancing was really good, it's probably already in just about every deck, so changing it will ruin just about every deck. This doesn't create an enjoyable experience for the player, so the Hearthstone devs almost never do this. Instead, they thoroughly test and balance the card before release, and then after the release, they usually let the players balance the game themselves. If one card makes one type of deck extremely powerful, that deck will start being played everywhere, and players will make decks to counter that one. When the counter decks start being more common than the initial deck, counters to the counter will start seeing play, and the wheel keeps turning. The game stays varied and balanced without the devs ever having to change a single stat. There are still some issues with this strategy. If a card is just way too strong, it might be seen in literally every deck, which will hurt the variety of the game, but Hearthstone has some countermeasures for this as well. In the next update, they might release a lot of cards that directly counter that one, in order to try to limit its play. And if all else fails, in a year or two the card will be moved out of the standard rotation anyways, and won't be able to see any more play, again adding to the variety of the game. A lot of the design of Hearthstone helps ensure the developers almost never have to change the stats of a card after release. In a perfect world, developers could make every update perfectly balanced before ever putting it into the hands of the players, but something is always going to slip through the cracks. Balancing is an important tool for developers, but it's one that should be used sparingly. Using it too often will push players away and will hurt your game in the long run.
The roof, the roof is on fire. Bring it back. The roof, the roof is on fire. Bring it back. The roof, the roof is on fire. Hit me. We don't need no water, let the motherfucker burn.